Don't leave me alone. Apache woman pleads for a new life with a cowboy. The sun hung low over the wide, endless plains, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. Dust swirled gently across the dry ground, whispering as it moved in the wind. In the middle of this vast land walked Aita, a young Apache woman whose eyes carried both sorrow and determination. Her small frame moved quickly and carefully, her feet leaving soft impressions in the dusty earth. Every step she took seemed measured, as if she were trying not to leave a trace, as if the land itself could sense her sadness. Aita had not always been alone. She remembered a time when her family's laughter filled the air around their small camp. Her mother's gentle hands would braid her long dark hair, while telling stories of their ancestors, stories of brave warriors, clever hunters, and wise women who had cared for the land for generations. Her father had taught her how to track animals, how to find water even in the driest seasons, and how to be both careful and brave in a world that did not always welcome her people. But all of that had ended months ago, swept away by a raid that left her with nothing but memories and the ache of loss. Now, Aida wandered the plains alone. She had learned to move quietly, listening to the whispers of the wind and the distant calls of birds to guide her. Nights were the hardest. She would wrap herself in a worn blanket, trying to sleep under the stars, her thoughts spinning around her family, the faces she would never see again, and the uncertain future that stretched out before her like the endless horizon. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for the memory of those she had lost. Every day was a struggle, every step a reminder that she could trust very few people. One late afternoon, Aita found herself near a narrow river that cut through the plains. The water sparkled under the fading sun, and she approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. She knelt and drank slowly, savoring the coolness, feeling the strength return to her body with each sip. As she lifted her head, her sharp eyes caught movement on the other side of the river. A man was there, tending a small herd of cattle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face and a leather vest worn smooth from years of work. His hands moved confidently, gentle but firm, guiding the cattle along the water's edge. Aita froze for a moment. She had learned long ago that strangers could bring danger, and the stories of travelers who had taken advantage of the weak were still fresh in her mind. Her instinct told her to turn and disappear into the brush, to vanish before he noticed her. But something in the way he moved, in the calm way he guided the cattle, made her pause. There was no harshness in his gestures, no anger or impatience. There was only focus and a quiet strength that she could not quite understand. The man noticed her at the same time. He tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture, not threatening, not intrusive. His eyes were kind, and there was a flicker of curiosity, not judgment. "Hello there!" he called softly, his voice carrying over the water. Aida's heart raced. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear completely, but her body did not move. She just stared, unsure whether to speak, unsure if she could trust this stranger. The man set down the rope he had been holding and stepped a little closer, keeping his hands visible. "You look like you've been walking a long way," he said gently. "Are you hungry?" "Thirsty?" Aida's mind raced. Hunger and thirst gnawed at her constantly, but fear gnawed at her even more. She wanted to speak, to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "Water." The man nodded and smiled faintly. "Of course," he said, pointing to the river. "You found it." He stepped back, giving her space. She moved closer cautiously, her small hands cupping the water, drinking slowly, savoring the cool relief it brought. He watched quietly, giving her the space she clearly needed, not forcing words, not rushing her. When she had drunk enough, Aida looked up at him. She did not speak at first. She only studied him, trying to read his intentions, trying to see if he was friend or foe. There was a softness in his eyes that she had not seen in a long time. She remembered her father's advice. "Trust is earned, not given. Watch, wait, and you will know." The man held out a small piece of bread from his pack, simple and plain, but it was enough to show his goodwill. Aita hesitated, then slowly took it. She tasted it, and for the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of comfort. It was not just food. It was a sign that not everyone was cruel, that some people could be gentle even in a harsh world. "Name's Ethan," he said quietly, as if introducing himself could help ease the tension. "I live just over the ridge with my cattle. Don't usually see travelers around here." Aita nodded silently, unsure if she should tell him her name. Finally she said, "Aita." The sound of her name on someone else's lips felt strange, but not unpleasant. They spent the evening near the river, sitting apart but not too far. Ethan tended to his cattle, and Aita rested, feeling the exhaustion of travel in her muscles. The sky turned deep blue, the first stars beginning to shine. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of the earth, the river, and the distant trees. For the first time in months, Aita felt something she had not felt in a long time. Safety, however small, however fleeting. As darkness fell, Ethan offered her a small blanket. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "It's not much, but it's better than the open plains." Aita hesitated, then nodded. She wrapped the blanket around herself and watched him as he worked quietly, preparing a small fire. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the ground, and Aita realized that this stranger might be the first person in a long time who saw her as more than just a lost girl. The fire crackled, the night grew still, and Aita closed her eyes for a moment. Memories of her family came rushing back. Her mother's laughter, her father's stern but loving eyes, the warmth of her younger siblings. Tears came, but she let them fall quietly. Ethan did not speak, did not ask, did not judge. He simply tended the fire and allowed her to grieve in peace. By the time the moon rose high, Aita felt a small shift inside her. She was still alone in many ways, still afraid of what the future might bring. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. Hope that perhaps not everyone in the world would take advantage of her. Hope that she could survive. Hope that she could trust again, even if only a little. And Ethan, watching her quietly, felt a strange sense of responsibility. He did not know why, but he knew that he could not simply let her leave into the darkness. He did not understand her past, her losses, the hardships she had endured. But he understood one thing clearly: she needed someone, and he could not turn away. The night deepened, filled with the quiet sounds of the river and the plains. Aita drifted into a light sleep, the fire's warmth surrounding her, the stranger's presence nearby, and the distant stars watching over them both. For that one night at least, she was not alone. And in the heart of the wide, endless plains, a fragile trust began to grow, a trust that would shape the days and weeks to come. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the plains, casting a warm, golden light across the land. Aita awoke to the gentle sounds of the river and the quiet movements of Ethan tending to his cattle. She felt a strange mix of comfort and nervousness. The night had been safe, but the world beyond Ethan's small camp remained unknown and dangerous. She stretched her tired limbs, brushing the dirt and dust from her clothes, and watched him work. Ethan noticed her watching and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Morning," he said. "Did you sleep well?" Aita nodded silently. Words were still hard for her in these new circumstances, especially with someone she had only just met. She had spent so long alone, relying only on herself, that trusting another person, even a kind one, felt unfamiliar and strange. Breakfast was simple. Ethan had some dried meat and bread, which he shared with Aita. She ate slowly, savoring the taste, grateful that he had thought to include her. After the meal, Ethan handed her a small basket and said, "There's work to do today. If you help with the cattle, you'll learn more about life on the plains." Aita hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted to get involved, but curiosity and the desire to prove herself nudged her forward. She took the basket and followed him. The day passed slowly, filled with small lessons and discoveries. Ethan showed her how to check the health of the cattle, how to notice the signs of illness or injury, and how to move quietly so as not to startle them.
Aida listened carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail.
She was quick to learn, her survival instincts giving her an advantage. Yet she also noticed that Ethan worked patiently with her, never raising his voice or showing frustration. His calmness was different from anyone she had known, and it made her feel safer and more willing to try new things. Between tasks, they spoke in short, careful sentences. Ethan learned a few words in Ayita's language, and she picked up simple English phrases. The barrier of language was still strong, but their shared effort to communicate made the moments meaningful. They exchanged stories through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple phrases. Ayita began to trust him more, realizing that he respected her pace and never pressured her to reveal more than she wanted. As the sun climbed higher, the heat of the day pressed down on them. Ayita felt the sweat on her brow and the ache in her muscles, but she also felt a small spark of pride. She was doing something she had never done before, working alongside someone, learning new skills, and discovering that she could still contribute, still be useful. Ethan noticed her focus and nodded in approval. "You're learning fast," he said, and Ayita allowed herself a small smile. Praise was rare, and hearing it made her heart lift. By afternoon, the bond between them grew stronger. Ethan shared a story about his childhood, growing up on these plains, learning to ride horses before he could walk properly, and helping his father with chores. Ayita listened closely, fascinated by the life of someone so different from her own, yet understanding the hardships of growing up in a world that could be cruel. In return, she drew simple pictures in the dirt, showing her life as a child, the landscapes she remembered, and her family. Ethan watched carefully, asking gentle questions, and Ayita felt a strange comfort in sharing pieces of her past. Evening approached, and the sky turned shades of pink and orange. They returned to the small camp near the river, tired but content. Ayita sat quietly by the fire as Ethan prepared a small meal. The smell of roasting meat and warm bread filled the air. She could feel the rhythm of the plains, the quiet animals, the gentle flow of the river, the rustle of the wind through the grass. It was a simple life, but it was real and honest, and for Ayita it felt like the first time in months that she was part of something steady and dependable. Night fell, and the stars appeared one by one, shining brightly over the endless land. Ayita and Ethan sat near the fire, the warmth comforting against the cool night air. Ayita's thoughts wandered to her past, to the family she had lost, and to the loneliness that had followed her for so long. She felt the urge to speak, to share her deepest fears, but the words were heavy. Ethan, sensing her struggle, simply reached out and placed a hand near hers, a silent promise that she was not alone. Over the next few days, Ayita settled into a routine with Ethan. They worked together, ate together, and learned from each other. She began to notice small details, the way he treated the animals with care, the respect he showed to the land, the patience he had with her learning. She realized that he was not just a protector, but someone who genuinely cared about life in all its forms. And in turn, Ethan discovered Ayita's quiet strength. She was observant, careful, and resilient. He admired how she adapted to the work, how she approached each task with determination, and how, despite the sadness in her eyes, she still had moments of laughter and lightness. One afternoon, as they rested under a tree, Ethan asked her, "What do you want, Ayita?" "What do you hope for?" The question was simple, but it struck her deeply. She had spent so long surviving that she had almost forgotten how to hope. Slowly, she replied, "I want a life that is mine, a life where I am not alone." Ethan nodded, understanding more than she could express. He could see that her words were not just about safety. They were about belonging, about connection, about finding someone to share the burden of living with. Days turned into weeks, and the trust between them grew. Ayita learned to ride a horse, guide the cattle through tricky paths, and even track animals for food. Ethan shared his knowledge without condescension, teaching her not just the skills she needed to survive, but also the confidence to believe in herself. And Ayita, in return, shared her insights about the land, the plants, and the signs of nature that Ethan had overlooked. They became a team, each relying on the other, each learning and growing together. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat quietly by the river. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, reflecting off the water in brilliant hues. Aita spoke softly, almost to herself. I never thought I could trust anyone again. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady and calm. You don't have to rush, he said. I'm here, and I won't leave. Her heart tightened at his words. For so long, she had lived in fear of being abandoned, of facing the world alone. Now, for the first time, she felt the possibility of safety, of companionship, of a future she could not yet imagine. But life on the plains was not without danger. Rumors of bandits and hostile groups circulated, reminding them both that the world outside their small camp was unpredictable. Aita's instincts, honed from months of surviving alone, were always alert. Ethan respected that vigilance, never asking her to lower her guard, but encouraging her to balance caution with trust. Their bond was a delicate dance of patience, understanding, and mutual care, each step strengthening the foundation of a relationship neither had expected to find. As the nights grew colder and the winds carried the scent of the coming winter, Aita realized she was beginning to imagine a future, one not defined by loss, but by possibility. She began to see Ethan not just as a protector, but as a companion, someone who understood even in small ways the weight of loneliness, the pain of loss, and the quiet joy of shared survival. And Ethan, for his part, began to feel a deep respect and fondness for Aita. She was more than a survivor. She was a teacher, a friend, and perhaps in time, someone whose presence would change his life as well. And so, under the wide skies of the plains, a fragile, beautiful trust began to grow. It was built on shared work, silent understanding, small moments of kindness, and the unspoken promise that neither would face the vast, sometimes cruel world alone. For Aita, this trust was a small spark of hope, a reminder that even after great loss, life could offer new beginnings. And for Ethan, it was a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could change the course of a life in ways no one could foresee. The days passed, simple but meaningful. Aita and Ethan continued their routines, learning from each other, sharing stories, and quietly building a life together in the heart of the plains. The river flowed steadily, the wind whispered through the grass, and the sun rose and set with perfect rhythm. In that vast open world, two souls, each shaped by their past, found a small space of safety, understanding, and connection. And as the fire crackled each night, Aita would close her eyes, feeling a sense of belonging she had not known in a long time, grateful for the stranger who had become a steady presence in her life. The weeks passed slowly, and the plains, though beautiful, began to feel more challenging as winter approached. The winds grew colder, sweeping across the land with a sharp bite that made every task harder. Aita and Ethan had settled into a rhythm together, their trust growing, their bond strengthening. But the world beyond their small camp was not always kind, and soon they would face a challenge that neither had fully anticipated. One morning, Aita woke to the sound of distant voices and hoofbeats. Her heart tightened. Even though she had learned to trust Ethan, her instincts told her that strangers rarely brought good news. She quietly rose from her blanket, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders, and stepped toward the river to see who was approaching. Across the plains, a small group of men was riding toward them. Their faces were hidden by hats and scarves, but the tone of their voices carried suspicion and tension. Ethan noticed her movement and followed quietly. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We don't know who they are yet." Aita nodded, her heart pounding. She had learned to read people quickly, and there was something in the way these men rode, their posture, their glances, their hushed murmurs, that suggested trouble. She stayed close to Ethan, ready to move if necessary. The men drew closer. One of them called out, "You there? Stop." "Who are you, and why are you on this land?"
Ethan raised his hands slightly, a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm," he said calmly.
"Just passing the time here. These plains are wide. There's room enough for all." The men hesitated, but one of them dismounted and approached more closely. His eyes flicked to Aita, and he raised an eyebrow. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone carrying suspicion. Aita stepped back instinctively. Her past had taught her to fear questions like this. Questions meant to judge, to take advantage, to control. Ethan noticed her reaction and placed a steadying hand near hers. "She's a friend," he said firmly. "She is with me." The man studied them for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Friend? Huh?" he said slowly. "We don't often see your kind together." Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not fully understand what the man meant, but he could sense the judgment behind the words. The tension was thick in the air, and Aita could feel her pulse in her ears. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words were trapped behind caution and fear. She had spent so long alone that any confrontation, any questioning of her presence, made her anxious. Ethan noticed her hesitation and gave a small nod, a silent signal that she could rely on him. She drew a deep breath, steadying herself, and kept her gaze forward, trusting Ethan to handle the situation. The man finally stepped back, muttering something to his companions, and they rode on, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Aita exhaled slowly, her body trembling slightly. She realized how much she had come to depend on Ethan, not just for protection, but for the quiet confidence he offered, the reassurance that she was not alone in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Ethan looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "They're gone now," he said. "But it's a reminder. The world outside isn't always welcoming."
Aita nodded silently. She had known this already, but the encounter brought it sharply into focus.
Trust and safety were fragile, easily disturbed by strangers, by suspicion, by misunderstanding. Yet, for all the danger, she also felt a growing courage. She had survived alone before, and now with Ethan she could face challenges not as a solitary figure, but as part of a team. As winter deepened, the challenges of survival became more pressing. The nights were bitterly cold, and snow began to dust the plains, making travel and work more difficult. Food supplies dwindled, and the river, once flowing steadily, slowed in places, making fishing harder. Ethan and Aita worked tirelessly, relying on each other more than ever. They hunted together, gathered firewood, and reinforced their small shelter against the cold winds. Each task was harder than the last, yet they met each challenge with patience, ingenuity, and determination. Aita learned to move through the snow quietly, following tracks, noticing subtle signs of animal movement, and understanding how to conserve energy. Ethan admired her skill and resilience, realizing that her survival instincts were sharper than many he had met. Yet, even as they adapted, the external pressures continued. Other settlers began to cast wary glances, whispering rumors about the woman with Ethan, while nearby groups of Apache warriors questioned why Aita remained with a man outside her tribe. The tension between worlds, between survival, culture, and the expectations of society, grew heavier. One evening as they sat by the fire, Aita spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the crackle of the flames. "Do you think they will ever accept me?" "That they will accept us?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Some may never understand," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean we give up. We survive, we work, we trust each other. That's what matters." Aita looked into the fire, tracing the dancing flames with her eyes. She thought of her family, her people, and the life she had left behind. The weight of belonging and acceptance pressed heavily on her, but Ethan's words gave her a small comfort. The first major challenge came in the form of a harsh winter storm. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, covering the plains in white. The wind howled, bending trees and making the river surge with icy waves. Aita and Ethan worked tirelessly to reinforce their shelter, pile firewood high, and secure the cattle. The storm tested their physical limits, but it also tested their trust and cooperation. Every decision mattered. Every movement required coordination, and every mistake could have serious consequences. During the storm, Aita's fears surfaced in full force. She thought of the world outside, of the dangers she had faced alone, and of the possibility of losing this fragile life she had begun to build. She turned to Ethan, her voice trembling. I don't want to be alone again. I can't." Ethan reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You won't be. he said firmly. "I won't leave you." Not now, not ever. The words, simple but powerful, anchored her through the storm. She realized that trust was not about certainty. It was about presence, about the commitment to stand by someone through the worst moments. When the storm finally passed, the plains were quiet again, blanketed in snow. The world seemed frozen, but the bond between them had grown stronger. They had faced danger together, relied on each other, and emerged not just surviving, but united. Aita felt a quiet pride. She had learned that strength was not only in survival alone, but in connection, in partnership, and in trust. Ethan, too, recognized the depth of her courage, her wisdom, and her resilience. They had faced the storm together, and it had shaped them both in ways they could not yet fully understand. But even as they recovered, rumors continued to stir. Some neighbors whispered about the unusual companionship, questioning whether it was proper or safe. Aida, who had once feared judgment and rejection, now faced it with a growing quiet confidence. She had chosen to trust, to rely on Ethan, and she knew that the path forward would not always be easy. Yet she felt ready to face challenges not as a solitary wanderer, but as someone part of a pair, someone with a shared purpose and shared strength. One afternoon, while checking the cattle along the river, Aida noticed tracks that were unfamiliar. They were too large for deer or smaller animals, and the spacing suggested more than one rider. Her heart tightened. Danger was never far in the plains, and she had learned to read the signs quickly. She signaled to Ethan, who immediately understood. They followed the tracks cautiously, staying hidden and moving silently. The tension was thick, but so was their reliance on each other. Every glance, every gesture was a silent communication born of trust and experience. Eventually, they discovered a small group of travelers, not hostile, but wary. These were other settlers seeking safe passage through the plains, and their cautious approach reminded Aita that trust had to be earned, not given freely. She observed them, noted their mannerisms, and listened to their conversation. Ethan spoke with them, explaining their presence, sharing supplies, and offering guidance for the safest route forward. Aita watched, learning not only the skills of survival but the subtleties of human interaction, the ways trust could be built and suspicion eased. That evening, after the travelers had moved on, Aita and Ethan returned to their shelter. She felt a mix of relief and accomplishment. She had learned to navigate the plains, to assess threats, and to act with both caution and courage. But more importantly, she had learned that she could trust someone fully without losing her independence, that she could rely on another without surrendering her strength. Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression and said, "You're learning more than survival. You're learning life." Aita smiled faintly, understanding the truth of his words. The challenges of the world outside their camp, the harshness of nature and the judgments of others were all forces they could not fully control. But Aida realized that within her partnership with Ethan, she had found a space of safety, understanding, and growth. Together, they had faced suspicion, harsh weather, and the constant uncertainty of the plains. And together, they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more connected than ever before. As night fell once again, Aida gazed at the stars, the vast sky stretching endlessly above them. She thought of the journey ahead, of the challenges yet to come, and of the bond that had grown through shared struggle. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I will not be alone." Not with him. And Ethan, hearing her quiet words, knew that their trust had been tested and had endured. The harsh winter continued to press down on the plains. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, turning the familiar landscape into a world of white and silence. Aita and Ethan worked together every day. Their routines adjusted to survive the cold and scarcity. The winds cut through their clothing and the nights were long and bitterly cold, but they relied on each other for warmth, comfort, and strength. Even in the hardest moments, they had built a rhythm, a silent understanding that kept them moving forward. One morning, Aita awoke to find the river partly frozen. She shivered, realizing how cold the water had become overnight. The cattle were restless, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. Ethan was already up, tending to the herd, his movements steady and calm despite the bitter temperature. Aida wrapped herself tightly in her blanket and joined him, her small steps careful not to slip on the icy ground. She admired his skill and patience. Even when the cold stung, he never rushed, never panicked, and somehow made the work seem manageable. Days passed and the isolation of the plains began to weigh heavily on Aida. The winter stretched endlessly, each day blending into the next. She missed human connection beyond Ethan, and the long stretches of quiet sometimes brought tears she could not hold back. She would sit by the fire at night, her thoughts wandering to her lost family, to the life she had once known, and to the uncertainty of the future. But Ethan was always there, quietly offering presence and support. He never pressured her to speak, yet his calm eyes and steady actions reminded her that she was not alone. One particularly harsh night, a fierce wind swept across the plains, rattling their shelter and snuffing out their fire several times. Aida huddled close to Ethan, seeking warmth and reassurance. "I can't do this alone," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. Ethan tightened his arm around her, his expression serious but gentle. "You won't have to," he said firmly. "We face this together, always." The words anchored her, giving her courage to face the storm. She realized that she had grown to trust him not just as a protector, but as someone who shared her burdens fully, someone whose presence made the impossible seem possible. Despite the harsh weather, they continued their work. They repaired fences, cleared snow for the cattle, and hunted where the landscape allowed. Each task tested their endurance and resilience, but it also strengthened their connection.
Aida began to notice small changes in herself.
She was no longer the frightened, cautious girl who had wandered alone across the plains. She was learning to anticipate danger, to act decisively, and to work alongside another person with complete trust. Ethan, too, was changed. He saw in Aida a quiet strength and intelligence that he had not expected. Her insight into the land, her careful observation, and her determination impressed him deeply. He realized that their partnership was more than survival. It was mutual growth. Each day they learned from each other, finding ways to adapt, to support, and to strengthen their bond. Their connection went beyond mere companionship. It was a quiet, profound reliance that neither had known before. One afternoon, as they checked the cattle along the river, Aida noticed fresh tracks in the snow. The tracks were unfamiliar, and their spacing suggested more than one rider. Her instincts immediately alerted her to the possibility of danger. She signaled to Ethan, who immediately assessed the situation. Together they moved quietly, hiding behind a cluster of trees to observe the strangers. The riders were travelers seeking shelter, but the suspicion in their eyes reminded Aida how fragile safety could be. Ethan stepped forward carefully, calling out in a calm voice to ease their tension. "We mean no harm. The river is safe for passage." The travelers hesitated but eventually nodded, moving along the path. Aida watched, her heart still racing, and realized how much she had learned in these months. She understood the subtleties of human behavior, the importance of observation, and the power of patience. Her survival had once depended solely on herself, but now she relied on partnership, understanding, and shared judgment. Despite the constant challenges, Aida and Ethan found small moments of joy. On calmer days, they shared stories of the past, laughed quietly at small mishaps with the cattle, and marveled at the beauty of the plains. Aida would trace her fingers through the snow, drawing images of her family, of animals, of the land she remembered from her childhood. Ethan watched, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply observing. In these moments, Aida felt a sense of belonging, a feeling she had not known for a long time. But the winter was not without its dangers. One morning, while they were gathering firewood, a sudden ice storm swept through the plains. The wind howled, carrying shards of ice that stung exposed skin. The cattle panicked, scattering across the field. Aida felt fear rising in her chest, a fear she had not experienced in months. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her to safety behind a ridge. "Stay close," he shouted over the wind. "We'll get through this." Together they managed to gather the cattle, guiding them to a sheltered area. The task was exhausting. but they accomplished it through trust, cooperation, and careful observation. That night, as they sat by the fire, Aita reflected on the day's events. She had faced fear, danger, and the harshness of nature, yet she had done so with someone she trusted completely. She realized that the bond she shared with Ethan was no longer fragile. It had been tested by both the storm and their reliance on each other, and it had endured. She whispered softly, "I never thought I could be this brave." Ethan looked at her, his eyes gentle. "You were always brave," he said. "You just needed someone to face it with you." Their journey through the winter continued, filled with challenges that tested their endurance, patience, and courage. Aida learned to anticipate the weather, to read the signs of the land, and to act quickly when danger approached. She became skilled at tracking animals, gathering firewood efficiently, and maintaining the shelter against the cold. Every day brought new lessons, new obstacles, and new opportunities to strengthen the trust between her and Ethan.
Yet the emotional weight of isolation and uncertainty remained. There were moments when Aida felt overwhelmed by grief and loneliness.
She would sit quietly by the fire, thinking of her family, her lost home, and the long road that had brought her here. But in those moments, Ethan's presence was a steadying force. He never tried to force her to speak or act differently. He simply stayed nearby, offering warmth, comfort, and the unspoken promise that she was not alone. One evening, Aida and Ethan walked along the river, the sky painted in deep purples and oranges. The snow reflected the colors, creating a serene and almost magical landscape. Aida spoke softly, her words filled with both hope and vulnerability. "I used to think I could only survive alone," she said. "But now, I see that life can be shared. That trust can exist even in a world like this." Ethan smiled, his hand brushing hers.
"And it will," he said quietly. "We'll face it together, no matter what comes." As the winter deepened, their bond grew stronger.
They relied on each other not just for survival, but for emotional strength, companionship, and hope. Every challenge they faced, the storms, the scarcity, the harsh landscape, became a shared experience that bound them closer together. Aida discovered courage she had not known she possessed, and Ethan discovered a depth of empathy and connection he had not expected. Together, they had created a small world of trust, understanding, and resilience amidst the vast and different plains. The harshness of winter eventually gave way to signs of spring. Snow began to melt, the river flowed more freely, and the land slowly revealed new growth. Aida and Ethan stood side by side, observing the changing landscape. They had endured the most difficult months together, and in the process, they had built a bond that neither could ignore. Aida felt a quiet confidence, knowing that she was no longer the lone girl wandering the plains. She had a companion, a friend, and someone she could trust completely. Ethan, looking at her, felt a sense of pride and deep respect. He had seen her grow stronger, wiser, and more resilient. She had survived loss, fear, and isolation, and now she faced the future with courage and hope. He realized that their journey together had not only helped her, but had also transformed him. He had learned patience, empathy, and the value of shared trust. The bond they had built was unbreakable, forged through shared struggle, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that they were stronger together. As night fell, Aida and Ethan sat by the fire, the stars twinkling above. She leaned slightly against him, feeling warmth and comfort she had not known in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for staying with me, for trusting me, for not leaving me alone." Ethan placed his hand gently over hers. "You would do the same for me," he said. "We face this together, always." In that quiet moment amidst the vast plains and the lingering chill of winter, Aida realized that she had found not just safety, but hope, companionship, and the promise of a new life. Spring arrived slowly, brushing the plains with hints of green and life after the long, harsh winter. Snow melted into the river, the ice cracking and flowing with a gentle roar, and the earth released the scent of new growth. Aida and Ethan looked out over the land, feeling the quiet thrill of survival and accomplishment. They had endured the cold, the storms, and the isolation, and now the world seemed to offer a fresh start, a chance to build something permanent and meaningful. Aita stood near the river, watching the water flow and listening to its steady rhythm. The long months of winter had taught her patience, resilience, and the value of shared effort. She thought back to the lonely days before she met Ethan, when fear and grief had been her constant companions. Now, the thought of facing life alone seemed impossible. She had discovered the strength in connection, in partnership, and in mutual trust. And Ethan, standing beside her, had become more than a companion. He was a steady presence, a protector, and a friend she could rely on completely. The idea of starting a new life together had been growing quietly between them. They had survived challenges that neither could have faced alone, from harsh storms to scarcity, from the dangers of the wild plains to the judgments of outsiders. Through it all, they had learned to communicate, to rely on each other, and to trust not only in themselves but in the bond they had formed. Aita felt a deep sense of hope. For the first time in many years, she could imagine a life filled with stability, companionship, and purpose. Ethan had been thinking of the future as well. He knew the plains were vast, but life on the move had its limits. He wanted a place where they could settle, where they could build a home that was safe and secure, where Aita could feel truly at peace. One morning, he suggested they explore a secluded valley he had noticed during their winter travels. "It's quiet there," he said. "Protected by hills, with plenty of water and land for crops. We could make it our home." Aita's eyes brightened at the thought. The idea of a permanent place, a safe space for both of them, seemed almost magical after months of wandering and uncertainty. The journey to the valley was not easy. The plains were dotted with patches of snow and muddy paths, and the river's swollen banks made some areas treacherous. Aita and Ethan moved carefully, guiding their small herd of cattle and ensuring that every step was safe. They communicated with quiet gestures and brief words, relying on the trust and understanding they had built over the months. Each challenge strengthened their connection, and every obstacle they overcame together deepened Aita's confidence in herself and in Ethan. When they finally reached the valley, the sight took their breath away. The land was gently rolling, surrounded by low hills that offered protection from the winds. A small stream ran through the center, fed by the melting snow, and wildflowers were beginning to peek through the thawing soil. It was a place of peace, untouched by the troubles of the outside world. Aita knelt by the stream, cupping her hands to drink the cool water, and felt a joy she had not known in years. "We can stay here," she whispered. "We can really live here." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of relief and triumph. "Yes," he said. "This is our new beginning." They spent the next several weeks preparing the valley for permanent life. They built a small cabin from timber and stone, reinforcing it against storms and cold. They cleared land for crops, planted seeds, and set up areas for the cattle and other animals. Every task required effort, patience, and cooperation, and every day brought new lessons. Aita discovered her abilities as a builder and a caretaker, skills she had never imagined having. Ethan marveled at her resourcefulness and determination, recognizing that she was not just a companion, but a partner in every sense of the word. Life in the valley allowed them to find a rhythm that was both peaceful and productive. Mornings were spent tending the animals and crops. Afternoons focused on maintenance and learning. And evenings by the fire sharing stories, dreams, and quiet laughter. Aita found joy in simple tasks, in the feel of the soil in her hands, the sound of the river, and the steady presence of Ethan beside her. She began to understand that home was not just a place, but a feeling, a sense of safety, belonging, and shared purpose. Joe baited him as he took notice the changes in Aita as well. She moved with confidence, spoke with calm authority, and laughed more freely than he had ever seen. Her eyes, once shadowed with grief and fear, now shone with determination, warmth, and hope. He realized that their journey together had transformed them both, shaping them into stronger, more capable individuals, and he understood that their connection was no longer fragile. It was a foundation upon which they could build a future. As the valley came alive with spring, Aida began to think about her past not as a source of pain but as a foundation for growth. She remembered her family, her childhood, and the struggles she had faced, and she felt a quiet strength in having survived them. With Ethan beside her, she realized that she could honor her past while embracing a future full of possibilities. She could carry the memory of her loved ones and still create a life that was full, meaningful, and joyful. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Aida and Ethan sat by the fire, the warmth surrounding them and the valley glowing in the fading light. Aida leaned slightly against him, feeling a sense of peace she had not known for years. "I never thought I would have this," she said softly. "A place to belong, someone to trust, a life that feels real." Ethan placed his hand over hers, his eyes gentle.
"You earned it," he said. "We both did."
Together, the days passed, each one filled with small victories and quiet joys. Aida and Ethan planted more crops, repaired fences, and cared for their animals. They explored the valley, discovering hidden spots, gentle hills, and quiet groves where the air was fresh and the world felt untouched. In these moments they laughed, shared stories, and imagined the future. Aida realized that her life had been shaped by hardship, but it had also been shaped by resilience, trust, and the companionship she had found in Ethan. The bond between them deepened as they faced new challenges together. Sometimes the weather would turn unexpectedly, or the cattle would stray, or supplies would run low. Each time, they relied on careful planning, cooperation, and mutual understanding to overcome the obstacles. Aida marveled at how much she had grown, how much she had learned, and how much she had come to trust someone fully without losing her own independence. Ethan felt the same. He had discovered in Aida a strength and courage that inspired him daily, and he knew that their life together would always be shaped by partnership, respect, and care. As the seasons changed, the valley transformed into a lush, vibrant place full of life and promise. Aida and Ethan had built not just a home, but a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, free from the dangers and judgments of the outside world. They had endured storms, isolation, and hardship, and now they could enjoy the fruits of their labor and the comfort of shared trust. One quiet night as they sat under the stars, Aida reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had wandered alone, lost and grieving, uncertain of her place in the world. She had faced fear, danger, and loneliness, and she had survived. And in the process, she had found Ethan, a companion, a friend, and someone who helped her see that life could be filled with hope and possibility. She whispered softly, "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Ethan smiled, his hand brushing hers. "I promised," he said, "and I always will." Together, they watched the stars twinkle over the valley, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a life built with care, trust, and resilience. They had faced the plains, storms, and uncertainty, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. Aida knew that the journey had shaped her into someone brave and capable, but it was the shared bond with Ethan that had given her the courage to truly embrace life again. As the seasons continued, Aida and Ethan nurtured their valley into a home full of life. They planted trees, cultivated gardens, and raised the cattle that would sustain them. Friends from nearby areas began to visit, recognizing the kindness and strength in their partnership. Aida taught them some of her knowledge of the land and its signs, while Ethan shared his skills and experiences. Together they became a small but thriving part of the community, respected and valued for their resilience and cooperation. Years later, Aida often thought back to the day she had wandered alone along the river and met Ethan for the first time. She remembered the fear, the grief, and the uncertainty, but she also remembered the small spark of trust that had grown into a life full of hope, love, and connection. She had found a new beginning, not just in a place, but in a person who had helped her see that she could survive, grow, and belong. And as she sat with Ethan by the fire, watching the sun set over the valley, she felt a deep, abiding peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led to a life she could finally call her own. Together they had faced the storms, endured the hardships, and created a home built on trust, respect, and shared strength. Aida knew that she would never be alone again, and that life, with all its challenges and joys, was something to embrace fully, with Ethan by her side, always.